You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. On this edition, a working group is now making a business plan for the creation of a public bank. What does that mean, and when could it happen?
It's not your board of supervisors that's sitting as the board of the bank. Part of the job that we have is to develop the governance structure, and that will include figuring out who is actually going to be on the board of the bank, who are they going to be accountable to, and how do we make sure that the members of that board are insulated from any conflicts of interest or apparent conflicts of interest. We are going to make sure that the bank governance is something that people can trust.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic. A working group of experts in different relevant fields, from finance to affordable housing, has now been selected to start work on a business plan for a potential public bank in San Francisco. We've talked about the concept of a public bank before. You might remember Jackie Fielder, who's been active on this issue and who co-founded the San Francisco Public Bank Coalition. Here she is explaining in a brief PSA what public bank advocates' issue is with the way things are now.
You pay taxes on your purchase to the local government. We think these taxes go straight to our community, but they do not. First, our city treasurer stashes it in big banks. Big banks invest our hard-earned taxpayer dollars to fund industries that promote pipelines, prisons, and weapons. Our tax dollars, our city, our bank.
This idea is moving incrementally from concept toward reality, and the selection of the working group is the latest step. I talked with two of its members recently. Fernando Martí is the co-director of the Council of Community Housing Organizations, also known as CHOOCHOO, a sort of affordable housing umbrella group. Sylvia Chi is an attorney, and she was the principal co-author of AB 857, also known as California's Public Banking Act, and she's a member of the California Public Banking Alliance. We talked about what happens next in San Francisco and what kind of a timeline we're looking at for the city to actually try this out. So let's start with some basics and maybe clear up some common misconceptions. The idea behind a public bank in general is that municipalities invest their money, and they usually do this through, big corporate institutions, which invest them in ventures of their own choosing, which can include things that the city might not want to support financially. So with a public bank, cities have an alternative to making those investments. Do I have that right? And how would you describe the main purpose of a public bank?
I think that's a good summary. The main driver for public banking, or what activated a lot of activists who are interested in it, including myself, is finding a financial institution that could hold city deposits and then not turn around and use those deposits in a way that was harmful to the city.
And can you describe what might be harmful to the city?
Some examples include using deposits to leverage investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. That was a very common motivation for a lot of activists in this movement. And other examples include wage theft. A lot of big banks have been found guilty of wage theft and other labor violations, and also predatory lending also to other industries that are harmful, like firearms and tobacco and private prisons.
Mm-hmm. Fernando, would you add to that? Is there something that you would describe as sort of the main purpose of creating a public bank for San Francisco?
Well, I think, from taking our deposits out of these harmful traditional either investments or banking structures, part of the business plan is then going to be, and what can we do with the lending capacity of a municipally run bank? What are the alternatives around the social and environmental goals that the city has that are either not being met by traditional lending, or where the leverage of a public bank could start to change how financing works.
Mm-hmm. Just to be clear, this is not going to replace anyone's credit union or offer checking accounts for any individuals. This is an investment tool for the city and not a personal banking option, right?
Exactly.
Okay. And are there examples of public banks that do offer individuals, banking services?
In the U.S., public banks are very rare right now. They were more common in the past. The major example is the Bank of North Dakota, which does not
Mhm.
do consumer services. But there are some other examples that are not as directly analogous. So, like the Territorial Bank of American Samoa is one that was really created to provide consumer services. But that is not
Mhm.
what this law is about.
Mhm. So, what is this law about? You're both members of this working group. It's going to move the city toward the development of a public bank. That means coming up with a business plan to submit to the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation for approval. It also means figuring out the timeline for the city to apply for a public banking license. How do you get started with something like that? How will you go about this?
It's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
The working group is supposed to start in the next couple months, I believe, and then we'll be meeting once a month for about a year, I believe. I think that one thing that we'll be doing is working with consultants who specialize in applying for bank licenses. Um, so that will help us just, use their expertise to have as successful an application as possible.
Sorry to interrupt, but there are specialists in this? Aren't we fairly new territory here?
Well, specialists in applying for bank licenses in general, not public bank licenses.
Uh-huh.
So that's the
Wow, I
closest we
didn't
can
know that
get.
was the thing you could specialize in.
Yeah,
Sorry, carry on.
yeah. But I think other than that, I think we're going to be doing a bunch of community outreach activities and making sure that the the public bank structure is meeting the needs of the community.
Fernando, do you think you're going to be going about this? What are some of the priorities for getting this off the ground?
Well, as a business plan is the kind of first step, is ensuring that the bank that comes out the back end of developing this business plan is set up with the infrastructure that it needs to achieve its goals. And so, for us as sort of the housing seat or one of the housing seats on this working group, the discussion will largely, or our interest is largely around how this business plan creates the flexibility and the ability for the bank to promote affordable housing goals in the city and housing stability goals in the city. We've got folks who will be looking at a number of other issues around the kind of alternative lending that the bank can support. And we need to make sure that our business plan going in creates a bank that has the ability to do those things.
Okay, you brought up a couple things there that I want to drill down on. The first is that is something I've heard before, that a public bank is going to advance the development of affordable housing. How?
Great question. And I don't have, the specific answers, but what I'll say is part of the way that we finance affordable housing right now is through loans through traditional banks. And those loans are not necessarily made because traditional banks love to invest and lend to affordable housing, but because we have laws in place, the Community Reinvestment Act, that require banks to do that kind of lending. That said, those are the same banks that are investing in fossil fuels, are investing in or have connections to payday lending institutions, all sorts of kind of bad actors. And so the city's investments, whether they're in affordable housing or others, are now tied up with all of these things that at the same time we're passing resolutions and saying, we as a city don't support these things. We're going to support Standing Rock. But we are not having an alternative. We're forced to do that. So the first thing that I think a public bank will do around affordable housing is compete with that kind of lending and provide an alternative where the interest is going back to the people rather than to these private institutions. From there, we can start to think about then what are new kinds of lending that is either not being done or it's very difficult to get the traditional banks to do. Some of that might be rapid acquisition lending. the kind of thing that we need to pounce on a piece of property or a building that speculators are looking at, that we can say, this is part of the goal. This is a safe investment. It's going to be permanently affordable housing. Those units are going to be rented forever because there is a need. This bank can move a lot faster.
And just to jump in for a second to clarify what you're talking about there, if an investor picks up a piece of property where there's been long-term renters in place for a while, the concern there is that they're going to just find a reason to get the renters out of there and turn the thing into like TIC condos or something, right? Tenancy in common condos. Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. And we saw a lot of this happen with multifamily buildings in the last recession. And again, part of this public bank discussion in San Francisco, it actually started in kind of mid 2000s, but it really picked up in 2008, 2009 with the Great Recession. And so we've been building up the political coalition and political support around this for 10 years now to get to this point. So one of the stories that I like to tell about lending and the impact that alternative lending institutions can have is that in San Francisco after the 1989 earthquake, banks were not lending to the owners of brick buildings that were either unsafe, had been red tagged, maybe had people living in them still, but needed to be fixed up given the impact of the earthquake. The voters of San Francisco stepped in and approved a seismic loan program that then provided loans specifically towards fixing up these buildings. And if you go, throughout downtown San Francisco, the Tenderloin, the North Mission, South of Market, Chinatown, a lot of those buildings were brought up to new seismic standards thanks to that lending that the city provided. But what happened soon after was that it changed the lending market so that the private banks now said, hey, wait a minute, this is safe. This is the city's doing this. Now we will start doing that kind of lending. It sort of created new competition, but it changed the lending world in significant ways. And I say that because I think that a public bank will not only create new alternatives that have kind of preferential lending for the kinds of social goals and environmental goals that the city sets for itself, but that it will also change the whole system. The things that a bank in particular could work on. First is kind of having a rapid acquisition capacity, having the ability to say when there is a building or a site that might be lost to speculation, that the bank can move quickly and acquire those buildings. And in particular, that's something that is really critical right now in the midst of COVID. As we're seeing, the news articles are talking about billions of dollars in capital that investors have accumulated to buy buildings that are in new precarity because of people's ability to pay rent and so forth. And so our ability to stabilize our own communities in San Francisco could be largely dependent on having a bank that is willing to step in and lend for that kind of acquisition. But beyond that, that's sort of the work that we are already doing in San Francisco and that we need more lending. There's a lot of really exciting conversations happening around social housing, around going back to building limited equity housing cooperatives the way we used to do in the 50s and 60s and 70s and haven't done for many years. The community land trust movement is blowing up throughout California. And all of these are new ways of addressing housing. And as those develop, we need financial institutions that will be ready to act and support those kinds of new housing opportunities. And at the same time, there are growing interest, although this has been a really long conversation. So I say growing interest. Now I think we've got something live from AFL-CIO around using their own investment capacity around affordable housing. And so what could it mean to have the public the city of San Francisco and its bank leveraging these new sources towards the kinds of goals that we set for ourselves as a city.
Yeah, you had mentioned.
So those were the things.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
You had mentioned pensions, and I was actually going to ask you to clarify what role do pensions play in the conversation around a public bank in this case. Maybe you can explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, not directly yet. I think part of building a business plan is thinking about how we leverage these other conversations that are happening. How do we create an ecosystem of alternative finance that really moves things in a big way? So I mention it because besides the public bank conversation, there are these other conversations happening within unions about how they invest their money, just as we're having a conversation here in San Francisco about how our city invests its money. And so there are potentials there to create synergies that can, create greater scale. So I think that's why I mentioned that, because this isn't just a unique conversation around city and cities and their investment.
I'm speaking with Fernando Martí and Sylvia Chi, who are part of the newly appointed Reinvest in San Francisco working group, which will create a business plan for a public bank in San Francisco. Sylvia, I was going to ask both of you, but maybe I'll just ask you now because we've talked about affordable housing for a little while now. This working group is required to have people with certain areas of expertise on it. And as I understand it, you bring sort of this broad understanding of public bank law and the context from the state level. Can you describe the seat that you have on this working group and how your expertise is going to shape that plan?
Yeah, so my expertise is through my participation in the California Public Banking Alliance, and I was one of the authors of the bill that passed in 2019, AB 857, that creates the licensing framework. It was the first in the nation, so that cities and counties can apply for these public bank licenses. So I have a good understanding of that law and the regulatory framework around it. In addition to that, I have expertise in clean energy and just transition. I was recently the policy director of APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which is an environmental justice organization. So I'm looking forward to helping develop out some possibilities for lending for clean energy and promoting resilience in the city.
And Fernando, I think it's clear your area of expertise is affordable housing, but did you want to add anything in response to that particular question about what expertise you're bringing to the development of this plan?
I think that's the answer. And, I think, as Sylvia said, there's a lot of potential new opportunities beyond sort of the big housing discussion. There's the discussion around low-income homeowners facing foreclosure, or as aging homeowners look to create new opportunities within their houses rather than kind of selling them to house flippers. There's a whole range of things. And in creating the business plan, I think we have to be aware of all those things. So in a lot of ways, in our small group of the reinvestment working group, we're bringing in our expertise, but we're also bringing in our connections and relationships to folks who've been working on all different parts of these social and environmental goals that we really want to set for ourselves and in the work.
Yeah, which brings me to a different question, which is where do you expect to lean on others' expertise to figure out how to do this? Because there are other people with specific areas of expertise that they're bringing to this working group.
Yeah, and that's I think part of the discussion around who should be invited to sit on this was exactly those relationships that we might have with, say, the Community Reinvestment Coalition, or with in my case with folks working directly in lending for preservation projects, for example, through the city's Housing Accelerator Fund. So there's a lot of, as we develop the outlines of what the bank will and will not do, and what is the fiscally kind of responsible outline for this bank, those relationships and connections will be vital to making sure we get it right.
Yeah. Sylvia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I wanted to just highlight that there are a couple folks on the group that have significant experience running financial institutions. So we
Right.
have um, folks from Self-Help Credit Union and Beneficial State Bank. So those are two mission-aligned financial institutions who, um, have a lot of experience that I think will be really helpful. And then some other folks on the group include a small business owner and some other people who are like closely connected with the community. So I think we have a good variety of folks who have the expertise that will um, make sure that this business plan that we develop really serves the community.
Hmm. Yeah, and that it makes sense. One thing that I feel like obligated to ask about because it always comes up when people see headlines or hopefully read entire articles about public banks is that they say, well, I don't really trust this government to make good decisions in general. Why should I trust them to run a bank? Especially when several of our city department heads were in fairly recent memory charged by the FBI with fraud and a corruption scandal that may still be unfolding. So there may be some assumptions wrapped up in that, but could you respond to that concern about having this city run a financial institution?
Yeah, I think the first point that I like to point out is just that it's not it's not your board of supervisors that's sitting as the board of the bank.
Yes, that's a good
We're
point.
so part of the job that we have is to develop the governance structure, and that will include, figuring out who is actually going to be on the board of the bank, who are they going to be accountable to, and how do we make sure that the members of that board are insulated from any um, conflicts of interest or apparent conflicts of interest. So that's definitely a big challenge to figure out how to get that balance right. But it's also important to note that in the process of developing this plan and then actually applying for the license, there will be a lot of back and forth with the bank regulators, and it's their job to make sure that, you know, any bank license that gets approved, that bank is not, run corruptly, and it's safe and sound. So we are going to make sure that the bank governance is something that people can trust.
Mhm. Fernando, did you want to weigh in?
I think that's perfectly right. I think it's interesting when people say that, and I'll fall into that kind of thinking sometimes. But I think one of the things to be reminded us is, how can we trust the private banks
Right.
after
Great
2008,
point.
especially, after in the foreclosure crisis when you saw person after person trying to figure out what was going on with their loans, and they were getting the runaround either directly from the big bank or from one of their subsidiaries. Yeah, if you're thinking about, on the small scale, sure, trust your bank to hold your money most of the time, but we've seen time and again not only major malfeasance and corruption, but just a system that either you know particular banks depend on predatory practices or have linkages. And as our friends at the Community Reinvestment Act have done all this, or Community Reinvestment Group have done the research around the payday lending groups that really are these predatory lending groups that are all connected back to the big banks.
Yeah.
So this is about creating an alternative with the social and environmental goals that a good governance structure put in place that is
Hmm.
accountable can create.
And I think that the more that there's conversation about this, the more people start to see, okay, I think I understand what the shape of this is now. But I have to admit, on this show, we've talked about the concept of a public bank and the possibility of it being developed in San Francisco, at least on 2 other occasions. And now we're at a point where the city has this working group and it's seated and you're working on this. But I think that maybe we should do a little bit of tempering of expectations, and I don't want to sound as though something is about to happen if it's not necessarily imminent. I think you had mentioned that this working group is gonna meet for about a year, once a month. It's gonna develop this plan. It's gonna develop a timeline. What should the residents of San Francisco be looking out for as a sign that this is really happening now, and what should we expect as this goes through the process? When is something actually going to start impacting San Francisco, and what should we be looking out for, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that it's important to keep in mind that the timeline is pretty long.
Yep.
I think starting any bank, like a private sector bank, is not something that you do instantly, and this will take even longer because of how new it is. I think that, hopefully a year after we get started, we will be able to create a municipal finance corporation, which is not a fully fledged bank, but will be kind of the starting point. And then the goal is that 3 years after that, the city is in a position to apply for the actual banking license and then have the public bank operating 5 years after we get started.
Okay, so not for a while.
Yeah, it's a long haul.
Yeah.
It can be frustrating, but of course, there are systems in place to make sure that what is created is going to be, the fiscally responsible thing. We've got huge ambitions about the alternative that a public bank can play to our dependence on these traditional institutions, and huge ambitions around the social and environmental goals we want to be able to support through the lending. But at the same time, we got to make sure that this is going to be solid and a safe investment for the city of San Francisco and the taxpayers and residents of the city.
Yeah. Makes sense. You don't want to rush this. Is there anything that either of you want to add about the concept of a public bank or this working group that I did not specifically give you a chance to talk about?
Yeah, I think the public bank is part of a much larger discussion about the role of the public in building the infrastructure of our city going into the future. And there's discussions around the use of public lands that some agencies might want to privatize. There are, of course, huge discussions about, let's say, Medicare for all. And I think it represents a shift in thinking that we're seeing in a desire from the public and from policymakers to really take on the public responsibility for these critical pieces of infrastructure, and financing and lending is right at the heart of it all.
Well, thank you both for your time and for explaining these somewhat tricky and difficult concepts for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
That was Sylvia Chi, an attorney and member of the California Public Banking Alliance, and Fernando Martí, co-director of the Council of Community Housing Organizations. Both are members of the new Reinvest in San Francisco working group. I'm Laura Wennes, and you've been listening to Civic. Before I let you go today, at the Public Press, which is Civic's parent organization, we've been working really hard during this pandemic to pursue angles we're not seeing much coverage of elsewhere, or to take a more systemic look at the issues that are surfacing in the headlines. The San Francisco Public Press is a nonprofit, and we're inspired by the public radio model. That's the idea that people who are able to support the work that we do so everyone can have access to it without paywalls or ads. If you think we're onto something, we'd very much appreciate if you could show your support. You can do that by going to sfpublicpress.org/donate or by helping us get the word out about this show. Subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use or leave us a review. It really does help, so thank you.